Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Greenlight Bookstore here on Fulton Street. We are actually here together in this room to host Andrew Lipstein presenting his new book, Last Resort. He's going to be talking with Cara Adams, so you're in for an excellent evening. I'm actually going to take my mask off here, because we can do that. It's just us booksellers here in the house tonight, along with Andrew and Cara. We are trying something new with tonight's live stream from the store and getting ready for actually hosting events with audiences again. So thank you for being here with us. Before I turn things over to Andrew and Cara, just a couple of housekeeping things. For those of you joining via the live stream tonight, welcome. Please feel free to share your comments in the chat and ask any questions for the author using the Q&A option in your Zoom window. Greenlight staff may read some of those questions aloud as part of our audience Q&A later in the evening. We are recording this event, so if it turns out well, we'll share it on our YouTube channel and other social media platforms later on. And most importantly, don't forget to buy the featured book, Last Resort. If you purchased a book bundle with your ticket, we thank you so much. Your book will be shipped to you or held at this bookstore location, depending on the option you selected. If you haven't bought a copy yet, though, it's not too late. We'll be dropping the buy link in the chat, and Andrew will be signing and personalizing books tonight. So just request signing or personalization in the order comments field at checkout, and get your order in at greenlightbookstore.com before 8:30 tonight if you would like something personalized. Your purchase makes it possible for Greenlight to continue to offer accessible event programming like this, and we thank you for helping to make this independent bookstore sustainable. Can you guys hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, our interviewer for this evening is Cara Adams. She has published dozens of stories in magazines including Granta, the Kenyon Review, and Narrative, which named her one of their 15 below 30. She's also the author of the award-winning novel You Never Get It Back, which she presented virtually with Greenlight back in December, so it's especially great to have her here with us in person. Cara is an associate professor at Seton Hall University and lives in Brooklyn and the Hudson Valley. She will be speaking tonight with our featured author, Andrew Lipstein. His writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Vice, McSweeney's, The Rumpus, Electric Literature, and more. And he's the founder of several literary ventures, including the digital bookstore Zeros and Ones, and the magazines Paul Ryan Magazine and The New Yorker. He lives in Brooklyn, New York with his wife Meta and son August. His debut novel, Last Resort, blurs the lines of fact and fiction with a thrilling story of fame, fortune, and impossible choices set in the New York publishing world. The book has received high praise from fellow authors including Sam Lipstein, Nell Zink, Gary Steingart, Tao Lin, and Joshua Ferris. Joshua Ferris writes, Last Resort is a strange and beguiling book about the contrivances, connivances, and mysteries of creation, with an especially visceral depiction of male anxiety and an absolutely blistering end. So this is a book that has many virtues, but I have to admit that here at Greenlight we may be a little bit prejudiced about our favorite part. As we're here on the brink of returning to in-person events after 2 years of virtual, Andrew's description of a packed house at a Greenlight book launch was a delight for us, if not for his characters, and made us feel like a part of the book world for better or worse. So we are really honored to have Andrew tonight to read from the new book, and then Cara's going to join him in conversation. You'll have the chance to ask your questions after that. So please join me in welcoming to the stage, Andrew Lipstein.
Thank you for that fantastic intro. So I sort of have to read an excerpt from part of the book that takes place at Greenlight because I just have to. Unfortunately, there is like some spoilers, so if you're at home and you haven't read it yet and you really don't want to be spoiled, maybe just mute for the next 5 minutes or go do something else. So in the first part of the novel, our protagonist, Caleb, basically steals a story that a friend has told him, and he writes a novel about using that story. Because what he's done is sort of borderline plagiarism. He has to strike a deal with the person who owned the story. And the deal that they agreed on is that Caleb gets all of the money from the book, but he doesn't get to put his name on it. His friend Avi does. And so in this excerpt, they're at the book launch of the book here in Greenlight, as was said, to a packed house. And Caleb chooses to attend against his better judgment. As I was waiting in line for wine, someone turned to me as if to say something, but then didn't. I was suddenly conscious of my facial expression, that my mood had taken a sharp dive. I saw my reflection in a window, but couldn't make out what I looked like, only my haircut, which now embarrassed me. that I had paid $120 for it just to stand by myself in the back with everyone else. I remembered that I hated book talks, even when the book in question wasn't one I'd surrendered authorship of. There was the interviewer, who is usually an at least somewhat well-known writer, performing her writerly awkwardness to the point of charm, speaking in a tone of voice that was so gentle it sounded passive-aggressive, lobbing softball questions that would give the interviewee a chance to expound on his creative process, to divulge his own quirky habits, to display self-effacement worthy of the breakdown stage of a cult. In response to these answers, the interviewer would give an encouraging nod on every fifth word, even before a cogent thought had been said, as if she couldn't agree more with, "I just think that the..." I checked my phone, 6:35. It was supposed to have started already. I watched the 2 empty stools up front, praying Avi wouldn't sit on the one that faced me. Soon it was 6:45 and then 7. A good portion of the crowd was now reading, a lot of them last resort. From what I could see, they'd mostly just started. This gave me an ill feeling, a sort of twisting in my stomach, which took me a minute to figure out. If they hadn't read the book, then maybe the small satisfaction I was allowing myself for such a turnout was unfounded. It really had nothing to do with me or my words. Maybe it was just the money that had been paid for those words, or the marketing, Avi's elusiveness, a few well-placed event listings. In a brief but darker swing, I even allowed that the money itself wasn't only my doing, that it was Avi's marketability that had inflated the sale price, that editors wanted a piece of this up-and-coming, handsome, suave young man, someone who was even one of their own. At 7:15, the door girl finally walked in front and thanked everyone for waiting. Her tone was apologetic, which was good, except that it augured bad news. She put on an "I feel you" frown and said, "I'm very sorry to report that Avi Dietsch will not be attending tonight's event. He's come down with the flu and regrets his absence." The crowd began murmuring and then talking at full volume. There were some groans. She clearly had no idea of what a lie she'd been party to, that Avi wasn't sick. He was absent for the same reason he'd been absent all this time. He had nothing to say about the book because he'd had nothing to do with its creation. I felt like I was being driven mad. I wanted to laugh. I tried to find Ellis. He'd probably made Avi believe he could do this, had enough hubris to think he could lead a horse to water and then make that horse talk intelligently about something he knew nothing of. The girl was quieting the crowd. "Please, please," she said. "We're still going to have the event. Please. We have a special guest. Please." She lifted a piece of paper from her pocket, raised her voice, and read a brief biography of Terence Copeland, listing the books he'd edited and the awards they'd won. Copeland walked in and waved off spattered applause. I'd never seen him in person before. He seemed a lot older than in the pictures I'd found online, and an interview posted on YouTube 2 years before. He looked like Steve Bannon if Steve Bannon had better skin and took more vacation. The door girl could feel the expectation and was milking it. "Our other guest tonight," she said, "is an accomplished novelist, and a proud Fort Greene local. The New York Times called her first novel, The muttering began and I couldn't hear the rest." People were disappointed, audibly. In walked Natasha Miller, whose debut Mise en Place had been out for 5 years, but not too long in the history of literature. But still it was pre-Trump and felt like an epoch ago. The book story had aged it remarkably, so much so that I couldn't imagine it getting attention today. It follows the waitstaff at a prestigious Manhattan restaurant as they fuck, do drugs, host elaborate dinners, and go to the sort of parties people who've never lived in New York dream they'd go to if they moved here. I didn't doubt why she'd been chosen to fill in, besides the fact she probably lived around the corner. It was to accompany Terence Copeland. Her presence and the sort of writing she was known for would work to reframe the ill repute that still shadowed him. Next to her, his vaguely prurient, devil-may-care aura seemed rakishly, refreshingly old-fashioned. Miller was in her mid-30s and wore a form-fitting maroon dress. His thick, baggy red sweater and khakis conjured up a long-tenured English professor. Together they were like an Reagan-era casting director's idea of a realistic couple. She started by asking a few thoroughly obvious questions, but then said she wanted to, quote, pivot to the elephant in the room. This briefly piqued the crowd, as if she might ask anything of interest. Avi's reclusiveness, Copeland's reputation, claims that last resort inhabited the male gaze. "There are some pretty steamy scenes here," she said, panning the room like a kindergarten teacher reading a picture book. Copeland didn't really react, which was awkward but also momentarily interesting. as if he might riposte with something pithy. The guy next to me picked up his phone and discreetly started taking a video. "I gotta admit," she said, "I'm not one to read a book more than once, but I'll say that there are some dog-eared sections in my copy." I admired her for admitting she didn't reread books. He was silent for 5 whole seconds and then demurred. She laughed that nothing was funny and then reframed her question to instead ask for any information about anything. And this established the template for the remaining 30 minutes. Question, demur, pivot to open-ended lob, self-regarding yet imprecise answer. Eventually she took questions, which mostly alternated between anodyne inquiries and accusatory statements with question marks at the end. "Did you anticipate the book would so easily find an audience? And do you find it odd that almost all reclusive authors who end up in the canon are male? And how did you arrive at the cover art? And have you considered how the protagonist might be seen differently if she were female? And what writer that you've worked with before does Dietsch most resemble? And some have noted that the book's homosexual scenes are couched in a strictly heteronormative narrative. Was this taken into account in the editing of the manuscript?" None received a straight answer except for the cover art question and, "Does Dietsch have another book in the works?" To which Copeland replied, "Not to my knowledge, but I'll have to hunt down his agent at the bar." This received a spate of chuckles and turned out to be a great time to call it. Miller thanked everyone for coming, and Copeland waved.
Well, I think I should start by saying congratulations.
Thank you.
It's a terrific novel. It's wild to hear that scene read
It is
aloud.
Yeah. To a packed house.
Mm-hmm. No, I feel like I both have to play to and against the stereotype of the...
Yeah, it's really a fraught talk more than any other after that.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for establishing that challenge for me.
Okay, you're welcome.
I thought that I would start by asking you about this word that gets used sometimes with debut novels, which is that better? The mic's on now. Not my performance tonight. The debut novels are often called assured. And I never thought very much about that word until actually reading your book. And I thought, I'm not sure anyone's actually said that about your book, but it's true. It just feels so assured. It feels from the first word to the last word as though you knew exactly where you were headed from the start. And you get us there just so beautifully, and in such an interesting and confident fashion. So could you talk a little bit about the process of writing the book? Was this the first novel that you wrote? What was the drafting process like? What resulted in this kind of miracle?
Sure, yeah. It's funny, if you kind of assume that books that don't get that adjective are kind of unassured, they're hesitant throughout the whole book. I mean, I think, every book that people read and ends up published in bookstores and people enjoy is assured. So it is a funny word to use because what could it possibly mean? My own, I think, journey had something to do with the tone, which is maybe, pretty direct, pretty fast, pretty straightforward, and usually not that ruminating, even though the character is. So my personal story is that this is not the first book I've written, nor is it the second, third. In fact, I wrote the book within the book. It's called Last Resort, which made the excerpts in the book as easy as just copy and pasting manuscript, basically. But a lot of those books that I had written that I couldn't sell, to me, when I look back on them, I think they're much more kind of intentional. I think that when I started writing them, I thought I'm writing a book. I'm a writer. This is a process where I need to sculpt things in a very particular way, and even of course, being younger, also wanting to demonstrate my skill, which is the death knell to any writer, and it's something I think a lot of even talented writers have to get over. Is that a book is not a place for them to demonstrate what they know about whatever, life or writing. And when you're 26, what do you know about life anyway? But when I wrote this, I had already had a ton of failure under my belt, and this was probably the first book I wrote that I felt more vulnerable when I was going into it. I obviously put more of myself into the main character, and was kind of willing to show myself a little bit, even if it was in an unpleasant way for me to see. You know, when people sort of talk about Caleb, he's not me, he's plenty different. But I do hesitate when they talk about him because I'm also like, you know, you're 30% talking about me. But when I started writing it definitely felt like it was coming from a much truer place than I had come from before. And I think that benefited me in just wanting to write. You know, I think at the end of the day, writing should always be fun, and you should always feel present. And that wasn't how I felt with my previous manuscripts.
Oh, that's so interesting to hear. I'm thinking about how the poet Mary Oliver, she has this beautiful book called A Poetry Handbook, and it's advice for poets, but also fiction writers. And she has a little section on language you shouldn't use when you write poetry. And one of the sections in that section is poetic language.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But it's true, I think you need a kind of confidence and maybe some failure under your belt to feel assured enough that you're writing for the reader as opposed to for who you imagine the reader imagining you to be.
Exactly. Yeah, the author should disappear, and I think the crucial word here for a novel proper is story. You know, what are you doing to support the story as opposed to, you know, I'm just editing my next manuscript now, and an editor had me cut, you know, the term darlings, right? Those little passages that you're so proud of, and that's a red flag right there, right? Because if you're so proud of it, then you've sort of made sure that it has a reason to be in the book. And so maybe it can actually be out of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, it's probably all about ego anyway. I think being a good storyteller in general is eliminating your ego as much as possible is always a good thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because you need to be thinking about your audience.
About the audience,
yourself.
yes, and the story.
Yeah. One thing that I really admired about the book was the plotting. It's so competent. The book just pulls you right through. I read it in like a day and a half, and I just couldn't stop turning the pages. And I was curious about that, about how you approach plot, which you know isn't always literary writers' favorite things to think about, but it's so crucial, I think, especially for the reader, to give them some suspense or momentum. I'm wondering if there are writers you look to as being great at plot, how you think about plot yourself.
Yeah, I'll answer the last part first because I think it's hard and my answer won't be that satisfactory. I honestly, most of the fiction I read is less plotted than this book is. And that might help explain the first part, which is that I actually don't really plan that much ahead. I kind of knew basically that Caleb would steal someone's story. When I started, I hadn't come up with the agreement that they reached, or basically anything that happens in the book. Which I think is important for me, and I'm sure most writers, plenty of other writers feel differently, but I think to be surprising, I mean the key thing about plot is that you're surprising, right? Like the juiciest plots, I mean that's why a lot of plotted books age so poorly, is that their plots become common and tropified. And the most crucial thing about plot is that it's surprising. And I think a way to ensure that, or help you get you there, is make sure it's surprising to yourself. So when I'm writing this book and the book I wrote after it, I try to like basically give myself threads as I'm writing, things that stick out from a scene, conflicts that are unresolved, and I don't know how I'll use them, but then when I'm going through the rest of my day, I'll be thinking about it. Which I think, like, you know, it's been said before, creativity comes from, you know, constriction, and feeling like you're sort of boxed in or not knowing there's a solution to an incredibly hard problem, I think is a great way, or at least how I think about plot.
I like that a lot. Now going to ask you another hard question, which has to do with another real strength of the book, I think, which is the humor. The book is very funny. I marked one passage that I was looking at just before the event tonight, in which Caleb has gone to a meeting and everyone is like very nicely dressed, and he's dressed in such a way as to suggest he hopes that he's both contrite because he's made a mistake, but also that he's an artist. And he realizes when he gets in that room that he's not dressed appropriately for the setting. And it's so funny and painful, and of course we've all been there, wanting to project some idea about ourselves with our clothes and it not quite coming off. So how do you think about humor on the page? Do you have any sort of theory about what makes something funny? I know humor is one of the most difficult things to talk about, but...
Yeah, I mean, well, humor is also one of the most subjective things, which I think is why, you know, I was talking about my previous failed manuscripts, and none of them were funny in any way whatsoever. I mean, I'm thinking of one in particular that was like basically the opposite of humor, whatever that is. I mean, so, you know, self-serious or whatever. As far as like theories of humor or how it works in fiction, I'm someone who, when I read on the back cover of a book that it's like funny or humorous, that's usually a turn off for me. I usually think that that's kind of going to be the point of the book, or the writer's like, some of the funniest writers today, you pick up their book and it's like, they've like cleared out space in a sentence for a joke. And they put the joke in the sentence, and then you get to the joke and you're like, ah, that's fun. And then you keep on going. I think that really the only way for humor to work is to work naturally within the story. And Caleb is such a, you know, self-defeating, frustrated protagonist that, for the scene you mentioned, it does, you know, come about without me having to really think about it. But I was also writing to try to kind of make myself laugh also, which I felt like was a little bit riskier because I felt like my sense of humor often isn't shared by other people. I think often when you think about the reader, it becomes this kind of like amorphous mainstream idea of like this, you know, 40-year-old person watching a Today Show or something. But I think kind of forgetting about that enabled me to like write for myself a little more.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how I think we often, or my experience at least, is that you both need to be writing for the reader and for yourself, and not for sort of a generic idea of a reader.
Right.
So it can't be solipsistic, but it also has to be sort of deeply felt by you to be true and be interesting.
I think that goes back to your earlier question about you know, what went wrong with my previous manuscripts, and I think it does come down to ego. You know, you can't be writing for yourself in a way that connects to ego at all, because then you're being a writer and not a storyteller. But at the end of the day, you can't be writing for this general audience that you can't even picture because they're not people, and some of the best storytelling and speaking and writing comes from like a more personal connection. So I was thinking about this idea of like the best book that could ever exist in the world has to be written by a particular person for one other person. Like how could a book be more, you know, because every book starts from with a blank slate that you're always having to write to other people. And I think that's a detriment to books. I think that's what all books are kind of overcoming, is that you're starting with a communal experience and you're driving towards the specific. So I was thinking about how wonderful it would be to like start from the specific and then write to the specific.
Yeah, maybe your third novel, you can...
Well, it would have an audience of one, so I think that would be a tough sell to my editor. Unless that one person happened to be like the Koch brothers or something.
You're right, you have to approach this the way a visual artist might, just to find someone who will
That's definitely more visual artist, is to write to the Koch brothers.
One extraordinarily rich customer.
Right. Well, one's dead, thank God.
So I was curious about your choice to set the book kind of in and around the publishing world. That maybe misstates it a little bit. The publishing world animates the book. So I think of the publishing world as being where art and business kind of intersect, where they come together. So what was interesting to you about that world?
Yeah, I mean, publishing is, to use that dreaded word, the milieu of the book. It's the background. But it's also, I mean, we were talking about agents before this, and agents are also kind of the perfect, you know, marriage of art and commerce in a way that only a particular person can become an agent. But, you know, it speaks to the whole publishing industry at large. Even the most accomplished editors have to be able to sell books to their publishing house, have to work with sales and marketing, have to know what's going to sell. It's something that I think gets a bad rap, I think, is the influence of commerce over art. I think publishers want to sell copies, but that statement could just be directly translated to they want many people to want to read this book and read this book. I think that the publishing landscape is such that now there's so many publishers that it's not like there aren't writers who are willing to overlook one or the other. Obviously, you have extremely commercial imprints, you have extremely literary imprints. But at prestigious publishing houses, even going through the publication cycle, which I hadn't yet, it's about business. A lot of the choices you make after the manuscript is sold is about business. We were also talking about covers, right? I mean, a cover, I think, is part of the artwork. It's part of the whole thing. But it also exists in a bookstore that people see. I mean, getting blurbs, like looking forward to reviews, like doing your author tour. Like, these are things that all are fundamentally about the art, but they exist for the commerce side of it. And that I think was interesting to me from the beginning, is how those things are intertwined.
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of tension, I think, in the world and then in the book too. I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about your process of publishing the book,
Right.
selling the book, because it relates to the story, I think, in some fascinating ways.
Yeah, in the book, Caleb gets what's called a big shot agent, which he thinks is a term used by too many people with too little irony, and that's the case in reality too. You kind of have these big shot agents, but they exist, there are big shot agents. So I was working with a wonderful agent. She and I made a lot of editorial progress on this book, and she could not end up selling it to a publishing house. We got one editor interested who we basically changed the ending for, and then he basically ghosted us. And which was sort of devastating, because you rewrite the last quarter of the book. It turned out to be a great thing because I love the ending. But I sent the book around myself to editors under a pseudonym, which I wouldn't recommend to anybody. Maybe it's a 1 in 1,000 that an editor at a major imprint will even open your email and respond to you. I sent it under the pseudonym of the protagonist, Caleb Horowitz. I think, given the tenor of the book, it's about the publishing industry. Maybe some editors thought that the person behind the pseudonym was their big name, which I'm not. Now, and of course, even back then, I was absolutely nobody. I work in tech. So it was just a crazy. I mean, I emailed my editor, Jonathan Glassie. He's a fantastic editor. He's like a stalwart. On Friday, I sent him the novel, and on Monday, he said, "I love it. Let's talk." And then he asked me, "Do I know you?" And actually, the same thing happened for my UK editor too. He wanted to make sure I wasn't a particular writer who's known to be a psychopath. He kind of worried I was, which maybe I should think about. But yeah, it was just a miracle. It was a lot of luck, yeah, and me being crazy.
And the hard work that you put in ahead of time to write the kind of
Of course, sure, yeah.
I love that in Last Resort, the book that gets sent out is sent out under a pseudonym as well.
Right.
So echoing your own.
Another metafictional layer, yeah.
Yeah, this is something that scholars, I think, will eventually be writing books about in the future.
About the, yeah.
All the metafictional layers.
I think it's funny because I think the book is metafictional, but as one of my early reviews pointed out, like, it's very much not how that word's usually used, which is it's not experimental in its structure. It's a 3-act story, which I think is a fun mix of these metafictional details, which maybe would normally belong to a book that's way more experimental.
Yeah, and I admire that about the book, just the kind of clarity of the structure and the way it sets out to do something with such assurance and executes it, but in a surprising way. While also playing with that kind of metafictional level too. Yeah.
Yeah, the cover was, I rewrote a passage in the book to match the cover retroactively, just to make that true.
Oh, that's great. So thinking about art and commerce and how they come together, the book also deals with the question of inspiration and where writers find inspiration. And I was curious about your own relationship to that.
Yeah, I think of inspiration as kind of like quantum, kind of binary, like 0 or 1. You get ideas that are good ideas. You don't really build up to them, I find. And that's sort of obviously a cliche, being something coming to you. But I think getting a conceit for a book, or getting like what matters or what sets it apart, is a lot about originality, and getting to originality usually isn't like a conscious thing. I'm like a big note taker. I'm a terrible sleeper. These two things are related. Like, I'll get up and go to the other room and write something down, and those ideas are usually always the best. Yeah.
That's so interesting. The rest of us scribble stuff in the night.
They're always also the worst, but yeah. They're like the most obvious, pretentious, annoying notes, and then sometimes you have some winners. Yeah.
That's where the binary comes in.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. My nighttime notes are often just like catch up ? It's
You're like, is this a grocery list? Or
Right. This was going to be a novella, apparently. So that's really interesting to hear. Do you remember sort of the moment when the idea for Last Resort came to you, or you had the first line, or can you pinpoint a moment?
Yes, sort of. So something like very distantly related happened to me. Basically, a friend read a story I wrote and thought that it had to do with him. And we had like protracted discussions about it to try to reconcile. And basically there were like a few details from his life, and I asked him if he thought the character was him, and he said no, but we still the conversations were very frustrating. I sort of felt like he needed it to be the case that his story was in the book, that the story was based on it. And that idea really confused me, and I found it really interesting. Like, what is it about art, from the very rare case of being written about to writing yourself in the book? What is it about that we like? What is it about this like preserving, consecrating act that we're attracted to? And I really had an emotional experience with this person, a lot of anger. And to be honest, I went to a friend's party and he was there, and it made me angry. Years after our conversation, and then I went home and started writing. Yeah. I mean, I didn't go home and start writing that morning, or even the day after, but a few days after.
Oh, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, because you mentioned that this was a book that felt in some ways more personal. You put more of yourself into the main character. And hearing about that experience makes me think about how male friendship is another thing that the book explores. And Caleb and Avi, the moment when the story is shared, that Caleb will write about, is one in which Caleb is very vulnerable. He's more vulnerable than he typically is, I think, throughout the book with other people. He cries, he shares some experience that's been really difficult for him, and Avi gives him what seems like vulnerability in exchange. Avi shares something that feels very difficult to share, perhaps, although that's, you do some interesting things with that, I think, as the book progresses. And then, of course, that has big ramifications for their friendship. So I'm curious just about male friendship, and of course, Caleb has another friend who has a very different relationship with, who's also a young man. But male friendship is something I'm not sure I've seen written about as much as one might expect.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that one word that you said, vulnerability, is the key to a lot of this brand of male friendship. Because a lot of men who are like me with their friends hide vulnerability so much that when it does come out, it's almost like even more powerful. It's like almost an epiphany. And it sounds like a strictly bad thing, but I don't know if I would completely say that. There's something else you asked about the other friend, or...
Oh yeah, so Caleb has another friend who
Right.
has a fairly different kind of relationship with, so it feels like in a way those two friendships are contrasted, perhaps.
Yeah, I think especially when you talk about writers and friendship too. I mean, and you put any two writers in a room together, and there's latent, however low, competition. And I think men of a certain demo are naturally competitive. So when you have two writers who are like that, It's impossible. The competition reaches such an apex that you almost have like, I mean, I think sometimes Caleb looks at Avi as like an older brother. There's something familial about it. And this other friend, Lewis, I think even in the book Caleb mentions that like, it's a good thing that Lewis is studying journalism. And it's a good thing he is, because if he was studying fiction, then they couldn't even talk about this sort of thing. But yeah, when you're talking about competition and ego, like those two things are basically the most live wire for vulnerability. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And it feels to me like in moments Caleb, looks up to Avi a little bit, or, thinks that Avi seems very confident. And then it feels like in moments when Avi seems a little less authentic or admirable in some way, Caleb both feels some kind of relief perhaps, but also disappointment or betrayal. It's a very layered characterization.
Yeah, I think admiration usually, like when that's the right word, admiration implies a distance. And I think whenever you admire someone, you're always admiring traits that are usually being achieved through the sacrifice of something else with most people. As you get to know people, I think they become, there aren't heroes and there aren't villains. Everyone sort of becomes, you realize that everybody's in the middle.
Yeah.
And I think admiration is something you can only really achieve with someone who you don't really know that well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, we get to know Avi a bit better as the book goes on. We get to know Caleb quite well, of course, but Avi as well. I think we admired him at first along with Caleb, and then come to see him in a slightly different light.
Right.
We see how much he craves a certain kind of recognition.
Right, and fails to see his own limitations also.
Yes, absolutely. And I like that sort of sense that we get to know both characters in a more intimate way as the book goes on, even though their friendship doesn't, deepen and become more intimate.
Right, it basically becomes nothing.
Yes, although they're sort of also locked in together in this kind of dance.
Right,
around the book.
they're tied and they wish they weren't. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And we have people like that in our life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was curious as well about, I think the book explores ambition and happiness and the relationship between those two things. And Caleb sometimes finds himself in a situation where it seems like happiness might be possible or at hand, but then he turns away because there's something else that he wants or needs in his life that has to do with writing and also with ambition. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you see those two things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think they're at odds, as has been said many times, but I don't think that for someone like Caleb, for many people who ambition gets in the way, the store brand happiness is available to them. You say Caleb turns away from happiness, and I think that's very much the case, but I think that implies a lot of intent on his part. When, the phrase, they can't help themselves, has sort of been removed from our vocabulary because it justifies actions that shouldn't be justified. And I think, just politically, the more we progress, there's a certain ownership of actions that have to be, appreciated. I think for someone like Caleb, and there are a lot of ambitious people, who they hurt the people around them, but they hurt most of all themselves. There's kind of no other way. I don't think Caleb would actually have been happy had he made the choices that on paper would have welcomed happiness more.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the book is thinking about the literary world and money and prestige. Right, sets up the question, which would you rather have? Caleb and Avi hash that out. But it does feel like there's something deeper driving Caleb as well. That there's some sort of need to write that feels, to me, like it goes, it's a little bit deeper than just ambition.
Yeah, I think the key difference between Caleb and Avi from the beginning, when Avi sends Caleb a short story that he wrote about his experience on Greece, which involves an orgy and deception and death fakery, is talent. So Avi's story is bad. Caleb is, when he first reads the story, he's intensely motivated by how bad Avi's story is. And you get pieces of the book. I mean, that's the point where he starts to write, is when he points out exactly what he would fix. And I think Caleb is talented. He's written a best-selling book that has something literary, at least about it. Of course, it's a hybrid, but Caleb does have talent. And I think at the end of the day, that's what drives him crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it feels like, maybe if Avi was driven enough to teach himself, he could get better as a writer.
Yeah, he's kind of a dilettante also.
Yeah.
Which makes him easier to root against.
Yeah. And I love that Caleb almost has a certain impulse to rescue the story. It's this great story.
Right, he's selflessly, bringing it into the world. Someone has to do it. Why? It has to be me.
Exactly.
Right.
But you also do feel like Avi never could have written that book. He just
Right.
never could have done it.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure.
Question of form and content. And yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I've got a lot of other questions I want to ask you, but I also want to leave some time for the audience to ask questions.
Sure.
We also have we finally got our mic working, so some of the booksellers and our little mini audience here might have questions. I wanted to ask, and I know it's like you don't necessarily write for yourself, and it's not writing is not therapy, but knowing that like there's some part of you in this main character, this kind of like very complicated main character, and also knowing the way you describe your writing process, did you learn something about the character, and did you have like any moments of illumination about your own like way of being in the world? Was that part of the process for you?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think the most obvious answer is also the truest answer, which is I learned a lot about my own ambition and how much that's tied to my own happiness, and how many times in the past I've forsaken my own happiness to try to achieve something that I want to achieve. And probably also selfishness, too, which goes hand in hand. Yeah.
Heavy.
Ooh, okay. I have several questions. I'll ask a easy to answer question first. Was there a real referent for the reading scene that takes place here?
I will say that there was. I mean, it wasn't, one for one, but I did attend an event at Greenlight, and I'll say it was by one of my favorite authors, and they were being interviewed, and I just felt like, the P word is a little pretentious. And I just felt like, there's something very obviously performative about a reading, but also just how people speak to each other on stage is like, thousands of years from now, when the aliens have all of our data and they're looking at what we do, they'll be like, this is such a weird thing. Like the alien sociologists will be like, book readings, like that's such a weird human thing, the way these people talk to each other. And they'll have like a whole like sub-department in an alien university.
You guys have been seeming really natural. But who knows what we'll look like to the aliens.
That's true.
I also wanted to ask about that moment from that interesting like emotional metabolism that went into like catalyzing the book for you. Having that encounter, that protracted like conversation with your friend, that sort of circled around these questions of borrowing or taking from experience or someone else's experience, and then like the anger, that confrontation, and then the writing that began. I was curious. It made me think about how many comparisons or like reference to the Bad Art Friend story. And the New York Times that this book has sort of generated in its wake, and I wanted to ask if you felt like writing this out answered or raised any questions for you about the relationship, about that process of taking from experience.
Did it make me think about the original interaction, or just the process of?
I just wanted to hear more about that arc.
Well, I think a lot of my inspiration, as you put it, has come from emotion, and I think I often have fueled that own emotion in me to make myself angrier, to be passionate, and to put myself in the book. I think that writing from emotion gets a really bad rap for books. I think some of the most celebrated but staid novels, you feel like the writer has like a yogic sense of calm, and because of that, they're so boring. I think especially specifically when you're writing a first-person novel, if you can, you know, sort of a form of acting, you're pretending to be the character, if you can make yourself feel emotions and not be able to catch yourself, you can come up with things that would, you know, defy you as a thinking person. I think at best we can like exceed ourselves. Like nobody is smart enough. That's what creativity is. You know, no one's smart enough to come up with things that are worth reading in their most like calm, logical state. So coming from like an emotional point of view like enables you to open up doors and like bring in certain things that an emotional character would see that you could have never come up with if you weren't actually, you know, empathy, not sympathy, feeling those emotions yourself. Yeah.
Anybody else? No?
Josie.
I was gonna bring up bad art friend.
We just talk about bad art.
Well, I have one question.
So many questions.
When did you start Frankensteining your old manuscript into the novel? Like, how did that become a part of this book?
Well, that was from the get-go because that was a story that that friend disagreed with. And, you know, I think that story had a lot going for it. And I think on paper, it was the type of story that The Last Resort and Last Resort is, which is this like a literary commercial blend. You know, I would never want that to see the light of day now. I think it's not good, not well written, and the plot has many problems with it. But I thought the parts that I could take were enough. Yeah. I also think that the creation of that was a little bit cynical on my part when I was trying to create a story that was like perfect for the publishing industry. And what happens in this book is that the book that is Last Resort is like every editor's dream. You know, there's like sex, there's cheating. It's like you can see it on Oprah, but you can see it reviewed in the New Yorker. How many books like bridge that divide?
The dream.
The dream. Every agent, editor, every writer secretly wants that.
Anybody else?
I'd love to jump in and ask another question, actually, which is about your female characters. Because I think you write women really well. And
You should tell that to some other people. But
well, Sandra, who is Caleb's girlfriend, was one of my favorite characters.
Okay.
I thought she was really smart and funny and interesting. Did you experience that as a challenge in any way to write a female character, or was it really kind of different?
Yeah, I think the struggle in putting a female character, especially being the love interest of a character like this, is obviously Caleb's ego is such that you can't have it be a black hole for the other characters. And that was honestly probably the thing that I worked on the most with my agent who I had, and a little bit even after it was sold, is making her stand outside of his story, which is difficult because it's a first person, basically egomaniac who's trying to accomplish his life dreams. So everyone gets sucked into his life. But, you know, at least in the first part, she also sort of helps him make the decision that he's going to spend the rest of the book undoing, which I was happy with because I thought, I mean, she is, at least against him, a voice of reason, a voice of logic, but I wanted her to be sort of complicit too. You know, that word is charged now, maybe too big of a word to use, but yeah, she's sort of also responsible for the decision he makes.
Yeah. One thing that I love is early on when they just started dating, she wants him to go with her to a party and to pretend to be her boyfriend.
Right.
Because, you know, she wants to, you know, sort of impress the woman who's throwing the party. And I think Caleb sometimes deceives himself maybe and others in ways he's not really aware of always. And he often works to justify something, and she just comes out and says, I just want you to lie about this.
Right.
And here's why.
Right, yeah, I think it's funny, I think that's a much more honest form of conceit, right?
Yeah.
Or deceit. You know, sometimes, like, I'm someone who hates stating lies, which doesn't make me less of a liar. It just means that, you know, you find ways around it. And Caleb is like a master at not stating lies, but, you know, lying something, either by omission or by bending the truth or whatever. But I did think that was, obviously a fault of Sandra's, but compared to Caleb, it's almost like a more honest form of deceit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a breath of fresh air.
Exactly, yeah, right. In a book full of liars, at least someone who's stating that they're lying is a relief.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, I thought she was great. And I think you said before that you admire both Ben Lerner and Rachel Cusk.
Yeah.
Who are two of my favorite writers too. I was curious if there were things that you kind of were thinking about regarding their work. They both deal with art and ownership and authenticity and honesty and storytelling in their work. Were you thinking about them as you wrote the book, or was it not such a direct kind
I
of?
think it's funny because some people, whenever I'm asked like who my favorite writer is, like that's basically the answer, but I always hesitate because that's like everybody's answer. It's like they're just so
So good.
I think they're so brilliant, and that's, I think, if anything, how I use them. I think when you read like very intelligent writers, it just gives you a little bit of permission to like try to be as smart as you can in your book, and not like in the way that like we were talking about earlier, where you're demonstrating your intelligence, but just like when you're writing a book, especially a book that's plotted, there's a lot of instincts that you sever to serve the story, to basically, a lot of plot turns that take you not playing to the top of your intelligence. And they are not very plotted writers, so they more naturally lean into their intellect. But whenever I read them, I'm just like, sometimes I get chills. I'm just like, books can be as smart as the writer,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like that's so much, the task, and it's surprisingly difficult, is to bring the full force of your intelligence to the page. It's interesting how difficult that can be sometimes.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about your second book.
Sure, yeah. It's on my mind because I've just finished edits on it. I think, we were talking about a family member of mine before this and how he might have influenced Last Resort, and I said that he influenced my second book a lot more. This is a family member of mine who's had an injury that sort of has made him stop working and is quite debilitating. And what I've found is that the things that influence you, or at least me, the most when I'm writing, are the things that I haven't even thought about when I'm writing. Like when you start writing, if someone were to ask you what your inspiration is, the answer you give is, or at least to me, is probably not correct.
Yeah.
It's the things that are on your mind that you don't really know how to figure out what they mean to you until you just, breathe that life into something else. That thankfully has nothing to do with that original thing, because that sometimes helps take the pain away, and it makes it less personal, and it makes it more of like an experiment where you can move things around and see how things fit together in a way that's a little abstract. But my second book, specifically, to give like a not completely abstract answer, is about somebody who works in quant trading, which is when you use algorithms to trade stocks, and he's a businessman, and he, through a prank, accidentally causes somebody else a great deal of harm, and doesn't know how to even confront what he's done or his part of it, and his guilt is sort of transmuted into something entirely different that has nothing to do with his original sin. And we don't have a title right now, which is on my mind every second.
I did really like the title that you originally were using.
Right.
Can I say what that
You
is?
can, sure. Maybe we can have like a reader poll or something.
Yeah. So it's Flash and Yearn,
Right.
which is taken from one of the dream songs, right? One of the
Right.
Yearn and dream
By John
songs.
Raymond,
Yeah.
Yeah, I do like that poem and I like that title, but maybe we could crowdsource the title.
I like it.
Oh, good. The audience is saying yes.
Yeah.
That's the one that begins, "Like friends is boring."
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of my favorites of his too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So I think we're almost out of time here. So unless there are any final questions, I think we'll turn it back over to Greenlight.
almost forgotten how this works, but I remember that I come back and say thank you to both of you for being here. It was great to have you here in the store tonight talking about this awesome book. Last Resort is here in the bookstore for sale through greenlightbookstore.com and at both of our store locations, and Andrew's going to sign some more copies for us tonight. So thank you guys for hanging out, and we'll get to the signing part.
Thank you. And I just want to thank Greenlight for having us, and Cara,